you, Les.
No worries.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Chat with the Mindful Beekeepers. We are going to talk tonight about natural beekeeping, understanding basically the living creature that the superorganism is, and get your answers to your most pressing questions, trying to address the things that you're seeing in your colonies, in the apiaries, as well as whatever other questions you may have based on the season, based on what you're learning around. And to do that, I've got Les Crowder with me, who is going to help me answer. He's got a huge amount of experience, and we are taking this time every Monday night to try and help you guys out. So Les, welcome to Chat with the Mindful Beekeepers, and I'll let you start with our theme for the day.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed last week.
You were in Jamaica. You were having fun on vacation with your family.
Yeah, and I forgot. But at any rate, it's good to be here. And what inspired this was you had that chat with Chris Barnes about antibiotics. And I remember when I was a kid, I questioned the use of antibiotics. And people thought, well, what's the matter with you? That's silly. The antibiotics are great. They're saving the world. And at the time, we had just begun to notice resistance to antibiotics. Penicillin had risen and then had begun to become ineffective because bacteria were becoming resistant to penicillin. And so there was a limit. So really, when I talk about natural beekeeping, it's more a matter of talking about long-term vision. And the long-term vision says we got here by nature and we have to keep with nature. In a sense, nature is all there is. We can't rebel against and poison our natural world and expect to get anything good for us out of it. And so the long-term version of antibiotic use was that naturally the disease causing bacteria was going to be getting resistant to the antibiotic. And then it turned out something else interesting. Bees are born with enzymes in their body to help them denature toxins. And that's just in case they run into a plant like a nicotine plant, has tobacco or something that has nicotine. Lots of plants make nicotine. That helps them denature the nicotine if they need to. But when you give the bees antibiotics, they use up those toxin denaturing enzymes to denature the antibiotic. Now they don't make more, so you've used up their protection from other chemicals simply by exposing them to antibiotics. And it turned out to be relatively easy to breed for antibiotic resistance. To breed for antibiotic resistance. So bees were being exposed to antibiotics, losing their protection from toxins, and then the antibiotics weren't working very well anyway against the germs. It also turned out it wasn't that hard to breed bees for disease resistance, and to change a few practices to help the bees stay clean and more bacteria free, like culling your own combs out of your brood nest, turned out to be a good practice for general bee health for a lot of diseases, and helped you eliminate the need or temptation to use antibiotics. So that was a long-term vision. It turned out to be a good vision. And now even USDA agrees with it, because now you can't go and buy the antibiotic at the feed store. You have to get a prescription because we recognize that we overexposed ourselves to antibiotics, to chicken products, dairy products, beef, and pork in particular, where these big operations were just using tons of antibiotics and developing germs that are antibiotic resistant.
Superbugs.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
that's a long-term vision. And, when I first went to work for a commercial beekeeper, I was a kid and I thought beekeepers would be kind of organic minded and nature minded. And he used antibiotics very loosely, even when the bees were making honey. And that, of course, is a great way to get the antibiotic in the honey because the antibiotic is
Mhm.
water soluble.
I mean, you eat it.
Right. So we're eating antibiotic. And then he was also using Roundup or soil sterilant, he called it, to kill the weeds in front of the beehives. I realized actually beekeepers aren't always organic at all. And now we know that there are people that think we're crazy not to use miticides, to question and even antibiotic use.
I think the quote was, if we always avoid treatments, it's foolish. And I'm like, we should always avoid treatments as much as possible by nature. But what is foolish is to, so using the treatments in moderation, you are introducing those elements into your colony. So, what is foolish really is the amount of poisons we put in our hives in the end.
Right. And if I come up with a disease and I don't see an alternative and an antibiotic would save my life, I'll take the antibiotic. But I see no need to give it to any bees ever because it's too easy to breed bees and keep bees in a way that eliminates the temptation to use it. And we don't need it in agriculture. We don't need it. We should learn not to raise chickens without it, cows, pigs, etc. So, yeah, I understand what he was saying always and never can back you into a corner, but I will never use my
Yeah,
treatments or antibiotics in my bees.
and
Ever.
I don't think we will ever use any kind of treatments in our hives either. And I don't think that's foolish. If it works for us, if our bees are healthy, how is it any foolish? The truth is, a lot of people are saying it's impossible for the bees to develop resistance in our lifetime because of evolution, and it takes so long. But the truth is, resistance and tolerance don't necessarily come all from genetics. It also comes from behavioral interventions by the bees that they can learn. We know they can do math. We've seen them learn to bite mites, to uncap the brood. All that doesn't take necessarily just genetics. It could be just a finding of the bees that just realized they could do it that way, and then maybe those traits can be passed down because there's genetics are favored. And but it's not all genetics, right, Les?
Yeah, I mean you're drifting into consciousness, which I appreciate, but a lot of people wonder about you.
They always do.
Well, me too. And yeah, and we have already known we have developed bees that are very mite and hive beetle tolerant and resistant, right? We now have hive beetles first came, the bees let them just walk right on them. Now they grab them by the legs and haul them out the door. The
Mhm.
hive beetles have to hide and scurry. So bees do learn behaviors or somehow acquire behaviors that make them much able to resist pests, parasites, and even predators.
Mhm.
So natural beekeeping is, in my opinion, the most competent type of beekeeping where we say, oh, here's a new pest. What do we do about it? And we search through natural solutions. We look for maybe pests of the past or we look for bees that resist it, and we breed. We let nature take its course. We work with nature's resistance. Because as soon as you get something resisting the bee, then the bee has to resist the pest. And that's fighting nature's resistance, nature's enemies with nature's resistance. As soon as we try to kill the pest, now we're fighting nature's resistance. And we know that the mites, for instance, became fluvalinate resistant, then acumulphos resistant. Now they're working on amitraz resistance. So the chemicals only last so long anyway, and they do a lot of damage to the bees.
Well, and the truth is, do we want to propagate genetics that are unfit, right? If those bees are not fit to thrive by themselves, why are we trying to use those genetics in later generations and potentially, because we've used those treatments, we've put additional pressure on the pests to develop and get stronger. We've pushed them to evolve to be super mites, for example. And so those colonies, by the way, treating doesn't mean the colonies are not going to collapse. Simply when they do collapse, the mites that are surviving and are getting sent off to the other colonies are more virulent than the ones that would otherwise be in a colony that's tolerant and that's working symbiotically and just is not putting additional pressure on the mites necessarily.
Right. And the other thing is when you breed, like back in the 70s and 60s when we used antibiotics all the time, now you're breeding bees while you're using them. You wind up breeding bees that are antibiotic dependent or that do handle the antibiotics very well. Now you've bred really a Franken bee in a sense, a weird bee that needs oxytetracycline to do well. So you can breed bees that are tolerant to chemicals, but why would you do that?
Right.
That's silly.
And I want to point out what Monty is mentioning on our Zoom meeting is that, and I'll go back to Sherry Lane's questions and comments after the fact, because Monty's are pertaining to the topic at hand. He says in a lecture on YouTube, Thomas Seeley, Dr. Seeley himself has said, although he hasn't specifically conducted an experiment, his observations suggest that it takes about 4 years for a population of bees in a certain area to develop resistance when nature is allowed to take its course. And that's what we've seen in other areas as well, especially in Africa and Jamaica, where they couldn't afford put the pressure on the mites and didn't have any of those treatments either available or within their financial power. So that's also something to keep in mind. And then that's what Bee Weaver in Texas, a very successful large commercial breeder of tolerant and resistant stock, has done. They initially lost a lot of bees, but within 3 to 4 years, they had really rebounded and more. And now they are able to supply a lot of the area with local survivor stock genetics. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Right, that's a very good point. And it isn't that hard. Bees are pretty amazing and adaptable. And we just need to trust them and give them a chance. Really, using the miticides only delays nature's survival of the fittest. And we're standing in the way. We're actually hurting the bees. People say, well, you know, if you don't treat, you're callous and just letting them die. Well, initially there was some of that, but now they're not dying. And there are still some people who believe, oh, they will, or they were lying or something. But we've not treated bees ever, and they're fine. And it really frees you up because now instead of worrying about mites and doing mite counts, and then just even the budget, like when Dr. talked about the Canadian beekeeper with his $150,000 miticide budget, said, man, that's a great vacation. You're spending that much money on poison to put in your beehives.
To your point. Yeah, to your point, is it worth spending all that money do you want to put the money onto the pesticides and end up not ahead financially if you're losing a few hives initially and then make them back later with stronger stock that you can sell for a premium? There's a calculation here that a lot of beekeepers are not making. And it's not all about selling the bees. It's just, it's been proven that if you have survivor stock in your yard, you've got more resilient bees. They're going to be better adapted to the local cycles of weather and forage. But it's not just that, Les. I mean, and what I always, we just went through the apprenticeship and we just talked about it. That was the core of the lessons. We talk about the scientific principles of integrated pest management. And basically it's represented as a pyramid. And at the bottom of the pyramid, we know that we can, if we understand better our pests, well, first, if we understand better our colonies of bees, or the creature itself, the biology of the bees themselves, but also the colony and their cycles and what it looks like when it's healthy, then we can understand when it's not looking good. And by understanding the life cycle and the symptoms of the disease and the pests that affects them, then we can very early on identify there's an issue. And that's the bottom, that's the very bottom of the pyramid. And that's a great and powerful tool because then we can intervene before things are serious. And there's two other levels that you and I go to, and that people that do natural beekeeping and just basically not using treatments, we still rely on the integrated pest management pyramid, and we go to the cultural controls, where to your point, we're looking at using good queens that are well fed, that are local survivor, and then they're well mated, hopefully, and we keep strong colonies. If we prevent from, so we let our bees go through brood breaks, meaning we let them follow the cycles of dearth and shut down and contract down, because that's a very cleansing, very detoxifying, basically, cycle where the mites cannot reproduce. So when we let them take those brood breaks, the mite population might grow 12-fold by the end of the year. But if we don't, if we keep feeding them, if we keep them in brood, those populations of mites are going to be 800 times fold. So by not letting them go through those brood breaks, whether it's a dearth and contraction, or as they're swarming, and potentially we can leverage that as splitting, then we end up with a lot more mites in our colonies. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. What are the things we can do less at the cultural level for the intervention?
Culling old comb out of the brood nest is something that a lot of beekeepers used to say, oh, I've got comb in there that's 40 years old. And I thought, and they were proud of that. But now we've realized that the beeswax absorbs toxins, which is good. It takes it out of the bees. But eventually it absorbs so much, it becomes toxic, and it's best to keep culling it out of the brood nest. So that's an important cultural practice to remember, to get your old brood combs eventually moved on up into the back of the hive, and then crush them or melt a little bit of beeswax out of them if it's worth it. The brood break. Mm-hmm. They're making sure they get chances to have a brood break. That's a great, yeah. Like this weekend we saw bees with very minimal brood. What that means is all the mites are out on the bees, being exposed to these bees that bite mites, and that's dropping the mite population dramatically. Now the bee population is going to start rising again once it rains and the flowers bloom, and they're going to leave the mites behind. The mites will start rising again, but then we'll have another brood break for the winter. And that's important. That's a great thing to have. It's not something to be viewed as negative. Then just trying to keep your hives nice and tight, keep the hive beetles out.
That's the mechanical level. That's the physical intervention, basically, what we can do mechanically. Yeah.
Yeah. Is any and then not lay comb down on the, if a comb breaks in the top of a hive, don't lay it down flat for the beetles to hide under it.
Right.
Don't give the beetles any place to hide. And then you don't have to worry about beetles. You know, you get to where you don't worry about mites or beetles. And that's a huge relief.
Mm-hmm.
That means you don't have to think about those chemicals, the expense of the chemicals, the administration of the chemicals, because you know the bees got it. They're fine. Don't worry about it. See a few beetles, hive beetles, no problem. No problem. You know, see a few mites, you don't have to worry about that because the bees are handling it totally fine. And that's the freedom that a lot of third world beekeepers have already found. We're just trying to invite American beekeepers to join us.
So I want to, with that, I'm going to hold off on the theme for the day and go back to a question from Sherry Lane before I go to Richard's question. She wants to know if you have an opinion about neem. It's kind of like an intervention, but on the outside. She's mentioning it because she has aphids on her okra and she's rinsing them off every day, basically blasting the aphids away. But they get out of hand. As a very last resort, we're thinking about 1 tablespoon neem, 1 teaspoon castile soap, and 1 gallon of water. So aphids, aren't they producing honeydew for the bees, Les?
Well, if there's nothing else, they may produce, bees may visit aphids. I've never seen aphids on the aphids and okra. I raise a bunch of okra myself. It's one of those vegetables a lot of people don't like, and some of us really do like. And turns out it's very good for your gut microbiome. I would, if you're just having too much trouble, I wouldn't worry about using a little neem on your okra. I don't think there's enough exposure to the bees to worry about. Neem is basically toxic.
On contact too, right?
Right. But it's I wouldn't worry about it too much on the okra because it's very minimal exposure. I've never seen bees work on okra aphids. Now they do. I've seen bees work pine tree aphids heavily and make honeydew, we call it, which is very strong flavored, even to the point of not very good in my opinion. But you know, the Germans consider black forest honey their finest honey, and that's mostly honey, what we call honeydew. It's from the aphids in the trees, it isn't from the flowers. So, and it's very high in minerals, but I've never seen any bees working the aphid on okra, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. I do. If you feel like it give you a better crop of okra, it's up to you.
So that answers that part of her question. And then she comments that they replace their sugar water inside the feeders in their tabar hives with plain water, and they're not drinking nearly the way they used to, but they're drinking it in Central Texas. So that's interesting. And it's something that, you know, makes sense, yet we have never tried. I mean, I had never tried to put water in my hives.
I have never either. So that is interesting. And I'd like to learn, experiment more with that actually.
We need to do more research.
Yeah.
So let's get to Richard's question before we circle back, because his is actually directly pertaining to what we were talking about earlier. Does Vera infestation get worse the older the colony has been successful? He's had no issue so far in 1 year and 3 months. Should he expect things to get more difficult in year 2, year 3? Original queen was not Vera sensitive hygiene, VSH, as far as he knows, likely treated before he got the nuke. Treatment free since he's gotten them, though.
Well, and they haven't requeened themselves. They still have the original queen. Richard?
Oh, sorry.
So we can't hear you. By the way, while we're sorting this out, I wanted to say hi to Bruce Rodriguez from Swarm State Bees and Gardening. It's nice to have you on tonight again. Thank you for joining us. He's mentioning that they make spotted lanternfly honeydew, and it's not that bad. So just keep that in mind. But Richard, you wanted to jump in? I think your sound is.
Oh, there it is. Can you hear me now?
There you go. Yeah.
That took a while. As far as I know, it is the original queen. I actually have pictures of when I first got them, the first time I saw the queen, and very recently in the last month. And as far as I can tell, they look very similar anyway. But
Okay,
they're not marked. She's not marked or anything, so that's as good an answer as I can give you.
that's good. But eventually the queen may start to fade, and they'll want to raise a new daughter or cast a swarm, and she'll leave, and you'll be left with a daughter. And that's a good thing. You know, we all need to be, everything renews itself. We all go on and then get plants fade and seeds sprout. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. When you start seeing, I've seen hives that, like Natalie has that one moray hive. We have no idea how many times it's swarmed. It's always still doing fine.
It's fantastic. It's huge. It's like about 3 feet tall.
Yeah. And they just keep going and going and going. I've also had hives that really did well and then kind of crashed or completely crashed, and then got a good queen and started off again. So, and the one thing you can do to help prevent problems down the road is to cull the old combs out of the brood nest eventually. That's hard to do in the hill country because you have to they have to build new comb. And they don't always get a chance to build a lot of new comb in our relatively limited honey flows.
So the other thing I wanted to mention also is they might or might not make it. They might not make it in their year 2 and in their year 3. The general consensus in the beekeeping community in the public is that, well, if you don't treat your bees, they will die, which is not true. And then if you say, well, I have bees that have survived, that have overwintered, well, it takes 2 years. When you tell them it takes 2 years, then they tell you in your 3rd year, they're going to collapse. And they keep moving the goalpost. And then you say, well, I've had a colony that's been alive for 8 years. And they'll say, well, it takes, 20 years. And I'm like, what's the point at this point, right? So the key is to keep monitoring your colony, allow them to go through their brood breaks, allow all the other, basic integrated pest management, just make sure they have natural comb, try to cycle out that dirty comb, which is contaminated with the pesticides as soon as you can, so that they don't rear brood at the very least, and so that it gets out of the colony, because it can kill your colony depending on what it is. We've seen synergistic effects from Apivar with other fungicides in the environment that created when one and the other are okay in by some standards, the combination of the two becomes extremely lethal and kills colonies. So you really want to cycle out that comb that might be contaminated with whatever pesticides they're using, especially if they're oil-based, because wax is lipophilic, so it will absorb that. And then the other thing you want to do is look and just keep watching, making sure that the brood pattern looks good, that they're looking healthy, that they're thriving. And if they're not, and they're starting to show signs of stress or failure to thrive, try to renew the genetics. If you can, sometimes stress is going to be an issue, so then you can condense them on smaller equipment and see if that's going to change things. Potentially try and feed them to eliminate that stressor from the environment. It might not be the genetics, it might be a combination of stressors, right? So try to eliminate some of them. If really nothing is helping, then you can try to requeen them. And if the colony is strong enough, you could just simply pinch the queen And if they have eggs, well, if she's no good, if the genetics are no good, it's eventually going to take a toll on your colony. So hopefully that's not going to happen in year 1 or in year 2, and they'll be large enough. And then, if they show signs of stress in year 3, you want to be on top of it. You want to make sure that they don't collapse without intervention. But you could just use the eggs from that colony for them to make a new queen and go mate. And hopefully that's going to be in your best weather conditions so that they have a nectar flow, so that it's the right time to make a queen. If it's a dearth, chances are you're not going to get very far. And in effect, you're keeping half of the genetics of that colony and introducing new genetics that are hopefully going to help balance the weaknesses of the first one and bring in hybrid vigor in your colony. So that's one way to do it. Or if you really think that, or if there's no eggs or they're really not good at all, you could always introduce instead a frame of eggs from a colony that's local survivor stock that's going to do really well, and let them make a queen out of that. So there's several options that you can make, but you don't have to right away. Not everybody has the options to find bees. Yes, it's easy to catch bees. It's easy to catch swarms. Sometimes it's also accessible to go and cut them out of buildings, but not everybody has that opportunity in time for their beekeeping season. And if they don't want to wait, this is an option to go and buy what's available on the market, understanding that you're buying, buyer beware, right? You pay what you get, you get what you pay for. Meaning, if you get treated commercial bees from Georgia, the chances are they're not going to work out as well, but they can get you as far as the next season potentially, where you can intervene and you can let them requeen and you can change the genetic makeup of that colony. But it takes understanding the biology of the honeybee. It takes understanding integrated pest management and how you can intervene. So really the best thing is to always educate yourself first and learn how to recognize, how to read your comb. Les, you were talking about that just this afternoon. Can you explain the kind of things that you're looking for?
Well, for instance, in your case, you got some bees that you don't know if they were treated or not. But if they've done well and they've survived without treatment, that's a good sign. I think a lot of beekeepers are treating bees that don't need it just because that's what they do. They assume, oh, I have to treat my bees. Maybe the genetics of my resistance is more widespread than we realize, and people are treating completely unnecessarily just by the calendar, not because of any need. But you can look through the hive and see how the bees are building, and you start to see patterns. Like in the spring, the brood nest is going to slowly begin to expand. It's always going to be radial, though. It's never going to be, they're going to put a little bird over here and a little bird way over here. They're always going to slowly expand it from the center. And then we can see, you learn to where you don't need to take the hive all apart and see their pattern. You learn, oh, I've recognized this pattern from last year and the year before and the year before that. They're beginning to expand now, or they're contracting, or whatever. And then you learn not to interfere so much, because often a lot of what we do just winds up interfering with the rearranged combs. They had arranged very carefully where they wanted them. And now we've got to rearrange them again because we messed them all up. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize this. I've had an extremely easy 1 year and 3 months. The bees seem to be happy, calm. They're being great. The 2 times I inspected, which didn't look right to me, you guys calmed me down and said, no, that's because you're coming out of winter. And of course, the dearth. So I just don't know if I'm just being lucky, if I should be confident in what I'm seeing and doing, or, should I brace myself for a harder time 2 years from now? Or maybe or this is the way it's supposed to be. I have no idea.
So So in the first year, you're probably not going to have a lot of issues, even if you stop treatment on a colony that would require treatment. To Les's point, they might not. They might do well in their second and third year and beyond. But if they start having issues, they're probably not going to show up in their first year, but more in their second and third year, and the way they overwinter. And by then, hopefully, you will have learned a little bit more to spot those issues ahead of time, and just to remedy them with integrated pest management if you need to intervene, and just make splits. Leverage the swarming instinct of the colony in the spring, make a split. Now you have, instead of that one colony, you have two. So there's backup, and the new one will make their own swarm cells and their own queens that are going to mate locally with your drones. So that queen should be better than the one that was in your original colony anyway. But if they both make it, now you can keep doing that, and the chances are they're going to want to make more swarms, and you're going to grow your apiary that way. If that one doesn't make it, you still have the one that you split from, right? So there's all kinds of ways to get around this.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Eventually that queen will give out, and yeah, so it's in the spring when they get to making a lot of honey. Don't give them more room.
Mm-hmm.
Get them to swarm. When they get to starting to raise queen cells, make a divide, and now you got more queens to play with, and you see a brand new, vigorous queen.
So the goal is to have, usually, if you're not growing your apiary, to have stronger, larger colonies within reason. You don't want humongous colonies because it creates other problems with pests. But if they're healthy, if they're strong, they're going to be more stable, like the aquarium comparison, right? The larger your aquarium is, the more stable it becomes, and the less variations in the environment stress the ecosystem, right? So this is kind of the same thing for a colony of honeybees. If they're too small, that everything stresses them a lot more. But if they've reached an established hive status where they're really into their own, then that shouldn't be an issue. But then if you're trying to grow your apiary, or you've lost some colonies and you're trying to make up for them, then so having large colonies, you want to make space so that they expand and they don't get swarmy on you necessarily right away. Understanding that you're giving up the swarming process in that cleansing cycle that they would otherwise, you wouldn't get a brood break, right? If you keep giving them space for them to build and lay eggs, you're not getting a brood break. The flip side of it is that if you're trying to increase or make up for numbers, you leverage. Let's just explain how you congest. You let it get congested, and that's the congestion that's really going to tend to trigger them to swarm, right? So make space if you want to get larger colonies, and let them get congested if you want them to go through a swarming event and get a brood break. So yeah, do I have any more questions, by the way? How big is too big for a tupper hive, Les?
Well, I have a friend who lived in Houston who said he filled 6-foot tupper hives from end to end. I have filled a 4-foot tupper hive from end to end any number of times.
Mm-hmm.
So, but Tom Seeley showed that about 10 gallons or 40 liters was the bees' preferred size. So that's because the bees are not looking into honey production. The bees are looking into when can we have enough to overwinter and then cast a swarm. And then, so half of one of my tupper hives that are 4 foot long is fine with me. That's what I mostly do now, because I'm not going for honey production. I'm going for bee production.
Mm-hmm. We do have some single full 4 feet hives that are well established, that will sometimes use as brood factories, as helpers for other colonies, and potentially, more honey production. But really, we try to keep them within that 2 to 4 feet on the tupper hive to keep them healthy and more in tune with what happens in nature. We do find a lot of very large colonies sometimes in nature, Les, but what do you say of the ones that we find in walls of structures, human-made structures, when they get much larger than they would in nature? It is in nature, actually.
Yeah, they are in nature, right? And I think that I have, for instance, gone to a barn in California where we saw bees coming out of several holes. We took the siding off, found out they were 3 separate colonies, very large colonies, all in the same barn, where they had swarmed and come right back and occupied, maybe one such space empty in between them, but within 6 feet of each other. So, and some of them get very large, but that's not as much true with the tropical bees. Tropical bees tend to stay a little smaller and swarm a little more easily. But we have a mix-up of bees from all over the world. It behooves a bee in the mountains of Germany to get really large and make sure it makes it through the winter. And they have a long, hard, cold winter. So storing a lot of honey makes a lot of sense. Whereas in the tropics, storing a lot of honey is just kind of a waste when they could be swarming. So it really depends on the genetics and the honey flow.
So Sherry's got a great idea. I don't know if anybody's ever done that, but she keeps joking about sealing off an entire room in their house and drilling holes to the outside to make it a bee room, a full colony, free to expand in the entire room. What do you think of that, Les?
Well, I think that they would expand. I mean, if you could make a space for them and they would come in. First of all, it might be too big. And they might not, Tom Seeley found that their preferred volume was about 10 gallons or 40 liters. So a really big space might make them feel like they're just completely open. I don't know. I mean, it'd be fun to try it. But you see them under trailers and things, but still they're often contained. So they might not feel contained enough to feel comfortable with that. But then we do see them under eaves of houses completely exposed too. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know.
It depends. But yeah, to your point, I guess bees are opportunistic and they'll sometimes do with what they've got. As in open air, they ran out of, options and they just decided to set shop on a branch. Might not be ideal, but they'll try anyway. However, to your point, maybe a smaller volume, like a closet, you could try, right? Instead of a whole room, maybe if you want to have.
That would make more sense.
Yeah.
You'd bait it with a little bit of comb and see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious because then how do you open the door if they attach the comb to it? I mean, it's a fun concept, but maybe put a panel. You know what? Who is it? Susan Nylans. She's the one that makes the scape hives and wrote a couple of books, including something about the bees. I have it somewhere with Jacqueline Freeman, Jacqueline Freeman's last book. And what she did is she had a colony of bees moving into her house and the bathroom, I think, in the wall behind the bathroom. And she put a sheet of, I don't know if it was glass or plexiglass, but transparent panel and let them have it. And she was able to watch them grow in her wall, basically, which is intense because, that's interesting. I mean, I would want to know what it does to my structure. Probably not much, as long as you don't let them die and rot in your walls. But that was very fascinating. If you go to her Facebook profile somewhere, you probably can see those pictures. It's fascinating. But yeah, that's an observation hive at this point. Unless I have, in Texas, Ruben, Ruben Solis is with us, and he's in Blanco County looking for an ag valuation using beekeeping as a qualifying activity, basically. And yes, it takes 5 years. For those of you who don't know, you can do that in Texas. I don't know if you can do that in other states, but you can get an ag valuation on your land between 5 and 20 acres using bees as your agricultural activity, your livestock in a way. And the only condition is to do the activities for 5 years and have the required numbers of bee colonies and the documentation to support your application in your year 6 to get that valuation. So he was asking if he could start with, he's got a top bar hive that he's built. I'm thinking from our, because I talked to Ruben and I just talked to so many people, but I think he built it from our plans. And he's going to start with 2 colonies, and he can do that in a 4 feet top bar hive, put a partition in the center, use only that one hive for the both colonies. So I think that's a great way to start and kind of increase over the 5 years in Hays County. If you're in Blanco County, you can do it as well. Not all counties let you do that, but these 2 counties do. And so that's a great idea. I will say that if you start with 4 colonies, if you can afford that increase in budget, you got more resources to share if something goes wrong. However, as a brand new beekeeper, you could also try to catch swarms and trap bees, but it's hard to do with brand new equipment. They don't like brand new wood that's not coated in propolis. Sometimes black comb or lemongrass oil or things can help you attracting bees, but it's when you first start, it's kind of chicken and the egg. You have to have the resources that smell good to the bees to get them in. I will say, if you're interested on how to catch swarms, Bruce on Swarmstead Bees and Gardening on YouTube and on the Treatment Free Beekeepers Facebook group is the king of catching swarms, and that's all he does. He never buys bees. He just kind of explains how to catch swarms easily so that you don't have to spend a dime on buying bees that might or might not be of equal or inferior value to the ones that you can catch yourself. The beauty of this is that these bees would be free. So even if you lost them, you wouldn't be losing much, and you would have gained a lot of experience and some resources that you can use to catch more bees in the second and third and following years. So there's something to keep in mind. Hopefully that's a lot more information that anybody wanted to know. But since I don't have any questions, if you guys have more questions, we have another 13 minutes before the end of this week's chat. I would say less in the meantime. What else did you want to talk about when it comes to natural beekeeping and the creature and understanding it and how to read combs and all that good stuff?
Well, the point of the way I started keeping bees was catching a swarm. Catching a swarm is kind of a magical thing. And really what's happening is the colony builds up and expands. And then it begins to backfill and contract a little bit, even if anything. Stop growing at any rate. And then it splits into 2 colonies. And if you can imagine a sparkler the kids have on 4th of July, it's lit. And each spark is a bee. And she lives too long and then she dies. But a new bee is constantly being born. So the sparkler stays lit. A swarm is when that sparkler splits into 2 sparklers. And they go on and on and on. And what that does is bees that are successful, that are fit, split themselves into 2 and 2 into 4. And the bees that aren't successful, they go out, they die off. And we always dread them going out. But if they need to go out, they need to go out because times have changed. And they're not ready for those changes. The ones that are the ones we need to catch. So catching swarms is probably the very best way to get bees. In my opinion, it's if you can set up swarm traps and to put your name out there and get on people's lists and catch swarms, that's by far and away the very best bees you're going to get. Almost always those bees are not treated, they're feral bees. They're really feeling their oats. They're adapted to the local climate. They're mite and disease resistant. And you're going to have a great time with those bees.
And let's say they're wild, they just escaped the apiary. If they've overwintered, they're already proven that they can do this on their own. So they're already probably better than if they were just purchased. And then the progression of their expansion and their health is going to tell you if they're worth anything. So what we always say is that if you catch bees, always give them a chance. A lot of beekeepers are talking about nonsense about requeening automatically or treating those bees. Don't do that. Just kind of get those bees and see what they do for you. Now, when we talk about catching swarms, there's a couple of things. Well, catching swarms and trapping swarms, there's a couple of things that you can do. So you can set up your box or a catching box in old equipment that's been used for colonies is the best for that. And old comb is going to help as well. Anything that makes it smell like a colony. And that's called trapping the swarm, having them come to the box, finding that an acceptable cavity for them to just move in without you doing anything. And the other thing that you can do is figure out who in your neighborhood and your community has found a swarm and just kind of it's hanging there from something, a branch or under a table, and go and collect them. Put the box underneath and just put the bees inside and bring them home and see if they stay. If they don't, you haven't expended much more than just your time. And if they do, you might have, like Les mentioned, some of the best bees you'll ever have, right? So
right, and you can you can greatly increase your own bees that way and get some really great bees. And it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it's fun to watch them go through the process of setting up shop and growing their first little combs and what the processes are that they go through, observing them that way. And it's hard to refrain from going in, and you can't learn as much if you don't go in. But just keep in mind always that the less you mess with the bees, the better off they are. So there's a trade-off in your first years where you want to learn and you might lose bees because of it. But in the end, the more you learn, the better off you're going to be later to be able to manage and troubleshoot before problems are serious. So what I would recommend is taking a good training course or finding people that are learning beekeeping at the same time, and just having at least one mentor that is qualified and experienced and can walk you through some of the basics. But frame time, as I call it, going into the hives and just observing the bees in what they do is the most valuable thing. So to increase the number of colonies you can go through in a week or in a month, having everybody's yards and just going through them, hopping through. This week we're going to Bob's yard, next week we're going to Susan's yard, and so on and so forth. That's going to go from the 2 colonies that you started with. Now you have Bob's 6 and Susan's 10. And so instead of having 2 colonies that you're bothering all the time, you're going through 18 without bothering your colonies as much. And that can be qualified as a beekeeping pod, is what I call. Just work with other beekeepers. Know that there's a lot of really bad information out there. A lot of Facebook scientists and experts and YouTube scientists and experts, and just kind of, you can always listen to some of the content, but realize that you always need to expand your learning to include various sources, because again, there's a lot of bad information out there. So make your beekeeping style your own, but don't fall to the pressure of those that tell you that if you don't treat your bees, they will die. That is not the case at all. So
if you're out in Blanco, you could call your several fire departments. Let them know you're a beekeeper looking for swarms.
Mm-hmm.
Call even exterminators.
Mm-hmm.
I had several arrangements with exterminators who really didn't want to spray actual swarms. And they would call me, and I would get the swarm, and it would be free and easy. And they got paid a little bit for calling me. And everybody was happy because homeowners see a swarm in their backyard. Sometimes they're terrified. They dial 911. And then if you have your name with the fire department, the department calls you, and you go pick up the hive. It's a free bunch of bees. You needed a home. You got a home that needs a bunch of bees. It's perfect.
So to Sherry Lane's question that's pertaining to what we're talking about right now, catching swarms and putting up swarm traps. She's asking, how far from your bee yards do you put up your traps to have better chances, I guess, to catch them? And my understanding has always been within around your apiary, but not in where your beehives are. This being said, stacks of used equipments, if you're using, Langstroth, that's going to have higher chances of attracting swarms. Les has got a great story about how his boxes in his garage left over from getting rid of Langstroth. I'm sorry, Bruce, attracted bees, right?
Yeah, I stacked some boxes in actually the garage or a shed where I was living. And then somebody said, well, how come you're keeping bees in the shed? And I said, I'm not. I went out and looked and there were bees. And it was a swarm. And I just picked it up and put it right in the beehive and carried it out to the bee yard. It was super easy. Same, also, I threw some hives in the back of the house. And I didn't put them level or top our hives. And I had been in a hurry and they were laying kind of at an angle in the backyard. My son said, I didn't think we were going to keep bees in the backyard here. I said, I'm not. He said, well, there's a lot of bees in those boxes. So if you have an empty bee box with some old comb in it, you may suddenly go out there and find out it's full of the bees and the bees have moved in. So you see pollen going in, there's a queen laying eggs in there.
So the general consensus I've seen, there's no general consensus on beekeeping on the internet, but some things I've seen is that when you have those swarm traps at the outer edge of your apiaries in 100, 200, 300 feet somewhere, you tend to have a higher chance of catching bees in your traps. And maybe that's because they smell the wax from the other colonies and the air currents coming out that smell like a beehive that might attract them. Or maybe the line of hives is kind of a marker in the landscape that might help them. I have no idea. The point is, Monty's saying that Tom Seeley has talked about ideal distances, basically averages based on the studies that he's made. But the bees don't read the books and they don't, I mean, when they have no other choice, they might have had a higher likelihood to pick the ones that were, at 40, 10 liters, 40 gallons, or that were 100 feet and that were 6 feet up in the trees or 20 feet up in the trees. That's true. But in the grand scheme of things, we find colonies of honeybees in cover holes for the water meters. We find them under tables. We find them in couches. We find them, they're just opportunistic. So he says that because of that, he doesn't get too hung up on ideals. He's limited by living on a suburban lot, but he hung a swarm trap in a front yard tree just in case and caught 2 swarms in that trap this year alone, which were about 100 feet from his backyard hives, neither of which was his escaped from his hives as far as he could tell. And then a week ago, he had another one land in a tree 10 feet from one of his hives. Again, he didn't think they were his either. So food for thought.
Yep, it's good to have him on. Swarms are the absolutely best way. So everything you can do to catch a swarm.
That's funny. I'm sorry. I have to read what Ray said. He said, happy to have Les back, but Natalie did a great job last week. Thank you, Ray. Appreciate it. But I'm really glad that Les is here because I had a hard time tap dancing last week by myself. Hey, James, it's good to see you. You're home. Nice to have you join us on YouTube. It's really great. So we have time for one more question. We have a minute. Anybody has a last thought or a last question? Anyone? Oh, Monty's kicking it in. I've heard it said that you can set up a perfect swarm trap in a perfect, it's not a question. You can set up a perfect swarm. So Richard, I saw you jumping on the keyboard. If you want to ask your question, you can. That you can set up a perfect swarm trap in a perfect location and bees will move into your barbecue grill. That's true. But just try to put your barbecue grill under the shade because if they are in the sun, that comb might fall really quickly. Ask us how we know. That gets hot really fast, especially in Texas, right?
Take them out of your barbecue grill and put them in a beehive.
Yeah,
As soon as you can.
yeah, it's true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So with this being said, we hope that this was helpful to you guys. Let us know if you have any more questions. If you like this content, you can always go on our YouTube channel and watch the past recordings. Click subscribe when you want to see, when you want to learn if we have new content, which we're going to try to bring more so that we can help you. We're going to do a lot more inspections with our phones, filming the inspections and talking through that to give you some more educational content in the bee yards, what we do and what we look at when we're inspecting, Les and I. And yes, Les, I have a chest strap for your phone. He's a minimalist and he doesn't take much to technology, but we'll see what we can do for you guys.
Yeah, I'll manage.
Yeah, so that sounds good. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week at the same time, 7:30 Central. And Les, thank you so much again for sharing your expertise. We've got people saying thank you. Always a great discussion. Thank you from Richard. Thank you all, by the way. And thank you, Les.
Thank you, Natalie. And thank you, everybody. Richard, and everybody. We'll see y'all later. Bye-bye.
Bye. See you next week.